Okay. Yeah. So, how to add GMAT GRE to your test prep tutoring business. That's the topic today. I'm gonna actually let me go to the next slide, but I'm gonna explain a little bit more about what I'm gonna talk about today because I want to try to be as inclusive as possible and cover as many interested parties as possible. So, my name is Brian Prestia. I'm the founder of Recent Test Prep. I've been doing GMAT GRE, SAT, and ACT tutoring for about 20 years. Most of that time I was a sole tutor, and more recently I've started hiring other tutors. Personally, my background is that I really started with the GRE and GMAT, and that led into integrating into the SAT and ACT. But as I'm going to explain in the next slide or slide after, I'm going to try to cover both sides, assuming that most of the people watching this and listening in are more likely to be going SAT, ACT to the GMAT or interested in going to the GMAT and GRE. But I thought I would also cover the other way around in case there's anyone who's interested in going from GMAT GRE to SAT, ACT, which again, that's really what I did. And then the other thing just about me is my expertise is more really with I'd say with the tests themselves and with the art of teaching and tutoring these tests. I have obviously I have a business here. I mean, I'm I'm going to try to touch on as much of the business aspects of this as possible, but I'd say a lot of this is to be about the necessary expertise of going from one group of tests to the other, and how to the tests themselves and how to tutor them, how to teach them. And then, I'll touch on the business side of things later in the presentation. And then obviously in the Q&A, I'm sure I'm not going to hit every aspect of the business side of that as people want. I wasn't exactly sure what kinds of questions people might have. So if in the Q&A, people want to shoot me questions, then I can maybe address them like that. So, okay, so let me get into the introduction here. So yeah, again, as I said, I'll mainly focus on, integrating from SAT, ACT to GMAT GRE, since I think that's what most people would probably be doing, but I'll talk about the other way around as well. We'll talk about the GMAT GRE and how they're similar and different. The main thing is they are very similar. So it's, if you're going to do one, you'd want to do the other. Similarities between the SAT and ACT on the one hand and GMAT and GRE on the other. Again, they're actually quite similar. So it's not that hard to integrate from the perspective of the test themselves, I would say. And then we'll talk about integration and how to master the tests, whichever direction you're going. Integration on the level of on teaching and tutoring, so not just the test, but the issues you face with the kinds of students you have, and how you deliver the teaching and the tutoring, in the SAT and ACT space versus the GMAT and GRE space. And then, like I said, the business considerations, I'll hit that towards the end. Okay, so I'm guessing that a lot of people listening in here already, know a fair amount about the GMAT and GRE, but in case people don't, I want to just quickly discuss, why these tests are used and what the market really is. So the GMAT is specifically for business school. The GRE is pretty much for all types of grad school at this point, pretty much everything but medical school. But the GRE is now accepted at all business schools, and I'd say a lot of the top law schools are now accepting the GRE as well. And then pretty much everything else, all other types of master's and PhD programs, even veterinary school is a GRE. So it's really only medical school that, a lot of people who are going to law school are going to take the LSAT, but many will take the GRE instead. So basically GRE is like an all-purpose test. And a lot of people who want to go to business school opt for the GRE instead of the GMAT. There's a myth that the GRE is just an easier test. That's really not true for a variety of reasons. I mean, first of all, the quantitative section is a bit easier, but the verbal section is harder. So I think the tests are actually quite similar. And the other point is that at the end of the day, you just have to outperform the same cohort of people that you need to outperform either way. So even if the test is easier, it's easier for everyone, and so you still have to do better than that same group of people. So if the quantitative section of the GRE is easier, which again it is a little easier, it's easier for everyone. So you just have to do that much better on that test. are in that section. You can take both tests. So again, in terms of integrating, I mean, if you're going to do the GMAT, you should do the GRE. If you're going to do the GRE, you should bring in the GMAT. They're super similar. It's not unlike the SAT and the ACT. They're similar enough that if you're going to be bringing in one, you should bring in the other into your business. Yeah, that's the next point. Obviously beneficial to offer both. Okay, about the GMAT and GRE. So I want to just quickly talk about the similarities and differences. Both test quantitative and verbal reasoning. They both have essays. The essays don't matter much, I would say, for most types of grad school, including business school. But yeah, the quantitative and verbal sections are pretty similar. We'll talk a little bit more about that. They're both computer adaptive tests. I'll talk more about the challenge of going from the SAT and ACT to GMAT and GRE, since it's computer adaptive. But they're computer adaptive in slightly different ways. If any of you are on this meeting that were on my last talk, I talked a lot about the differences between the types of computer adaptive tests, but not very important for this discussion. They cover similar content knowledge. I think people misunderstand that and think that, because the GMAT has a reputation for being harder, it's harder math. That's really not true. It's pretty much the exact same math, I would say. It's super, super similar. It's almost exactly the same. And there are a lot of similar question types. So problem solving questions on both tests, reading comprehension, argument questions. The argument questions on the GMAT and the GRE have slightly different names. So it's called critical reasoning on the GMAT, and really it's lumped in as reading comp on the GRE, but it's identical. So very, very similar in some ways, but there are differences between the tests. So yeah, some of the quantitative stuff is different. So on the GMAT and GRE, they both have a unique quantitative question type, data sufficiency on the GMAT, and quantitative comparisons on the GRE. And those are still similar, but different enough that they require sort of a slightly different skill set and different practice. Verbal is where the tests are really most different. So the GRE has vocabulary, the GMAT does not. The GMAT has grammar-based questions like the SAT and the ACT. The GRE does not. So that's something, it's an additional thing that has to be brought in. If you're doing GMAT and GRE, you really have to be dealing with both of those things. As I said, slightly harder quantitative section on the GMAT, slightly harder verbal section on the GRE, but really the difference is slight. People really overstate that. The GRE does have an on-screen calculator, so that's another difference between the tests. Again, if you're going to bring in tutoring or teaching for both of these tests, it's just something separate that you have to deal with. The calculator is not available on the GMAT. That's not exactly true. They have it on the integrated reasoning section of the GMAT, but not on the quantitative section, and the integrated reasoning section doesn't matter very much to business schools. So it's pretty much as if you don't really have a calculator, at least you don't have it on the sections that really matter. Okay, and then how the SAT and ACT compare to the GMAT and GRE. So I think this is the more important point is, if you're going to integrate in either direction. So the main point is there's a lot of overlap. I for years did SAT, ACT, GMAT, and GRE tutoring, and and I've really never done anything else. And that's because those four tests are so similar that it's easy for me to do all four of them, and it would be hard for me to do the MCAT or really anything else. So these four tests, in my opinion, are very, very similar. Not completely, but yeah, there's a lot of overlap. So it's a similar body of content. I think that's probably the most important thing. It's you have the same, very similar kinds of math on all four tests. You have grammar on 3 of the 4. Again, the GRE doesn't have grammar, but SAT, ACT, and GMAT, those 3 all do. So, reading comprehension, I think that's going to get to my next point in terms of the question types. So yeah, a lot of similar question types as well. So reading comprehension, it's harder on the GMAT and GRE, but it's obviously a very similar skill set. Again, grammar-based questions, they look a little different on the GMAT than they do on the SAT and ACT, but still testing kind of similar things. Problem solving, math questions, those are, I will regularly use ACT questions with GMAT students and GMAT questions with ACT students and SAT students. So, I mean, I wouldn't use a ridiculously hard GMAT, problem solving question with an SAT student if it were just unrealistic that it would ever appear on the SAT. But yeah, they're similar enough that I will regularly dip into questions from different tests and use them with students. And I encourage my tutors to do that too. Differences. So yeah, again, vocabulary on the GRE, that's a major difference. It's not a big deal from a test prep perspective. It's something you guide people on how to do vocab study, and that's pretty much it. But that is one major thing. Another thing is the GMAT and GRE, as I was saying before, they both have this unique question type that gets at whether you have enough information to answer a quantitative question. That's just completely different from anything on the SAT or ACT. So that's another, another just major difference. And then argument questions again on the GMAT and GRE. Yeah, I think the major difference is that the GMAT and GRE are really just much more reasoning driven. I think that's why they're harder. I think that's my next point. They're more difficult, but I think the misconception might be that the math is harder on a pure math level, and that's just not the case. In fact, it's the other way around. I think the SAT and ACT get into slightly more advanced, pre-calc type things, and the GMAT and GRE, it's actually lower level of math, but just trickier questions and more robust reasoning and critical thinking that you have to apply. And as I mentioned before, GMAT and GRE are computer based. Obviously SAT and ACT for now, paper-based. That's seems like that's changing. Obviously for the SAT it is. But that's obviously another slight challenge of adapting to tests that are currently given in two different formats. Okay, so vertically integrating the GMAT and GRE, mastering the tests themselves. So I think before I get into the details here, let me just say that I think part of the assumption here is the idea is that you're trying to build mastery within your current cohort of tutors, or as a business owner. Obviously, you could just hire someone who's a master of the GMAT and have them, start a GMAT business inside of your tutoring company. So that's not really what I'm addressing here. I'm more addressing, taking your current cohort of tutors and having some of them go from SAT, ACT tutoring to GMAT and GRE tutoring. That's something I've done I've trained tutors for that type of sort of upward migration. So in terms of doing that, again, content is very similar. GMAT and GRE are harder, as I said. So that's one challenge, is just pivoting to a more reasoning-based approach, I think. Your tutors and teachers need to be able to handle the more difficult, I guess content is not really the right word there, but the more difficult type of reasoning and critical thinking that needs to be applied and taught. And so, I think probably a lot of, SAT and ACT tutors would be fine with that, additional sort of upward challenge, but maybe some might not be. So that's maybe that might eliminate some people. But yeah, I mean, I think that, in most cases it could be mastered. I mean, I think about the level of mastery that I have of the GMAT and GRE, compared to where I started. And yeah, I mean, over time, you learn the types of questions and you learn the underlying content that might be unfamiliar. And, it's something that you can take existing tutors and help them become masters, existing SAT, ACT tutors, and help them be masters of, GMAT, GRE stuff. Vertically integrating from the GMAT and GRE to the SAT, ACT. Again, this might not be relevant to that many people, but this is kind of what I did. So I thought I would just touch on it in case this applies to anyone here. One thing is there is additional content to master. So it's not so like again, the reasoning aspects of it, I think, are easier, but there is additional math, for example, on the ACT, matrices and vectors and things like that. I mean, those things don't appear on the GMAT and GRE. So there is some additional math and, the body of content knowledge that it's good to have for the science section of the ACT also there, that could be something that you might be totally foreign to some of the tutors. It was definitely a bit foreign to me when I tried to sort of downwardly migrate to the SAT and ACT. There are, yeah, I mean, some completely different sections. So it's not just the knowledge base of the science section, it's actually knowing the strategies of the, ACT science section. That's completely foreign to anyone who's really, doing the GMAT and GRE. There's nothing really like that on those tests. And yeah, I mean, if you really want to, be qualified to be tutoring the SAT or, teaching the SAT or ACT, I think it's a good idea to go and sit the actual test. The way, I would make a tutor sit the GMAT or the GRE in order to, teach your tutor the GMAT or GRE. And so, yeah, if you're someone who's been doing GMAT or GRE tutoring and you're 40 years old and you're going to go take the SAT at a high school, that can be embarrassing. I've done it many times. So that's maybe one other aspect of this. Okay, vertically integrating to the GMAT and GRE, just not the test now, but how you're actually what you're encountering when you're teaching and tutoring these tests. So there are definitely some differences, and these are things that I don't know if I would have anticipated when I made this sort of transition. So these are some things to highlight. First of all, it's a totally different demographic of students with the GMAT and GRE. Number one, they are a more discerning group of students because they are the client. So unlike with SAT and ACT tutoring, where the parents are paying for and looking for the tutor, the students are primarily the ones looking for the teacher or tutor or class or whatever. So it's a much more discerning client or customer that you're dealing with, and so I think you have to deliver a much more crafted message to attract those people, and I think you also have to deliver a better product. Frankly, I mean, you should obviously be trying to deliver a great SAT and ACT tutoring and teaching also, but you're going to be held more accountable, I think, when in dealing with the GMAT and GRE. Also, you're dealing with people who are older. They're generally in their mid-20s. They're much more mature and much higher expectations for what's going to happen outside of the meetings. Many hours a week, as opposed to maybe 2 hours or 3 hours or something like that. I'd say you'll get some GMAT students who are going to do 20 hours of work a week. So a lot different. Also, just a very different dynamic because you're dealing with adults. You're not dealing with high school students. So by this, I mean, there's different aspects to this that I'll touch on, but just they're adults. So you're dealing with something that feels more like a peer as opposed to something that feels more like a child. And so it's just a different dynamic. I could envision that there would be some tutors who would excel when dealing with a 16-year-old, but would not be that great and with someone who's closer to their age. And then some the other way around. I mean, I think depends on the person. Also, it's a different timeline, generally speaking. I would say for the GMAT and the GRE, I think it's just longer, and it's also more flexible testing. So the tests aren't given on certain days like the SAT and ACT. You can basically take it any day, and because they're now delivered online at home, you could even do it any time. You want to do it on Sunday at 3 o'clock in the morning, you could do that. So it means that it's a different cycle of the business cycle is a little bit more flexible. It still revolves a bit around when the application deadlines are. And I can talk about that, but you have people studying for it, for 6 months or 8 months, and they might start in January and finish in the summer. They might start in the summer and finish in December. It's a much more kind of flexible schedule and typically longer. Also, you're dealing with students who have, generally speaking, just different kinds of availability. Obviously, nights and weekends are still, common, but a lot of people nowadays, work from home, or, they have flexible work schedules, and so they can do it. They can do tutoring or classes in the middle of the day. So that's kind of an advantage when you have a GMAT GRE business. And then, yeah, again, there are some challenges in how you teach for a computer-based test. And I don't think those are big challenges, but it's a little bit different than preparing people for a paper-based test in terms of what kinds of practice materials you're going to have them use. Having them work off of screens as opposed to actual books, I think that's a good idea. I could talk plenty more about that too. And then integrating to the SAT, ACT, again, I'm guessing this is not relevant to that many people, but it is what I did. So I'd like to just hit on this for anyone who's interested. Yeah, again, the students, that I think is the major difference. So I think, with SAT, ACT kids, with high school kids, it's much more of a mentoring role. I think kids will tend to look up to their tutors sometimes, and you're really setting an example, much more than with a 25-year-old student. I think you're also doing a lot more confidence building, number one, but also just awareness of psychological problems. Probably isn't the right the right word to use there, but awareness of, you find out that, from the parents, that the high school student that you're working with has been battling depression and or super anxious about the test. And high school kids are less likely to tell you that. They don't tell you what's going on, and you sometimes wouldn't know that they're really going through serious challenges. Whereas I think in the in the GMAT GRE space, you're more likely to know what's going on with the student, and get it directly from them. I think that's a big deal. And then, yeah, again, different expectations for what a student will do. So it's not just, okay, well, they're only going to do 2 hours work, not 20 hours work. That's one thing. But you also, I think to me, this is a significant issue, is much more so need to monitor what's actually happening and set the right expectations. With, in the GMAT GRE world, the students are much more honest about what they've done, what's happening, and you're dealing directly with the student. I think I maybe said this in the next point. Yeah. Whereas with the SAT and ACT, first of all, you might not know, maybe the student's lying to you about what they're doing, or you're not as aware of what they're doing or what they're not doing. And then you're also not always communicating directly with the parents. And so there could be a gap in the expectations where the parents think that the score is going to be great, but it's not, or you might not even know if you're not aware that the students are not doing as much work as you think they're doing. So it's a much bigger deal, I think, if you want to really deliver good results and not disappoint people, to be on top of what students are doing outside the meetings. Okay, business side of things. So again, there's probably a lot more I could say about this, but let me just hit a few main points, and then maybe if anyone has questions, I can address those directly. So GMAT GRE tutoring versus teaching. I think that I don't think there's much of a market for classes, basically. So I should have maybe written that as tutoring versus classes. But I think there's a big market for tutoring. I think there's not as much of a market for classes, especially if you're a small company. I mean, if you're Kaplan or you're Manhattan Prep or something like that, yeah, they run a lot of classes. But I think most GMAT GRE students who are going to look for a class, they're going to go with a big company. So I think, like, at a local level, independent outfits, I think there's not much you're going to get for classroom teaching there. Whereas obviously with the SAT and the ACT, there's much more of a market for that. So I think for the GMAT GRE, with very, maybe a few exceptions, I think it's mostly going to be tutoring, unless you're a huge company. Different market in terms of the parents and the students. So yeah, I mean, in the case of the SAT and the ACT crowd, you're really marketing more to the parents, right? And in the case of the graduate school admissions crowd, you're really marketing much more so. I mean, occasionally parents are looking for a tutor for their 25-year-old, but it's overwhelmingly the students themselves. And so it's just a totally different type of messaging, and it's a different, you're targeting a very different market. You have to message differently, you have to aim in a different place, because you're trying to attract parents as opposed to the students themselves. So I could say more about that, but I think that's a major difference and kind of a challenge. On the flip side, there are some connections between the markets. I think that, especially if you already have an SAT and ACT business going, to kind of go upstream to the GMAT and GRE, if you've been in business long enough, some of the people you've tutored, and if you have all of their contact information, and you're occasionally marketing to these people with a newsletter or things like that, some of those 16-year-olds are now 20 or 22 or 25 or whatever, or they have older siblings. And so I think I don't think it's a huge overlap there, but definitely if you have a wide enough, former client base and you can reach out to them, I think and it's been long enough that, they're at the right age group, well, then that's an easy market to try to attract. But I think it doesn't work very well. It doesn't work as well the other way. So I mean, if you have a GMAT and GRE business trying to integrate to the SAT and ACT, I think it's just less, most of those people don't have siblings who are 15 or 16. And so it doesn't, you don't have time on your side. You're working in the wrong direction unless you have a time machine and can go back. So yeah, a little less you can do there in that direction. And then another just difference, the SAT and ACT is obviously a really big market. Most kids are still taking the test. It's a huge number of people taking the test. So the GMAT and the GRE is smaller, far fewer people taking these tests, but it's also kind of a higher percentage of potential clients, because most people who want to go to graduate school, especially if it's law school or business school, it's super competitive and the scores matter a lot. I mean, your GMAT and GRE scores, I would say, matter much more to graduate school admissions than your SAT and ACT scores do to undergraduate admissions. So you might have a smaller base of people who are taking the test, but a much higher percentage of those people are looking for help and willing to spend money to get the kind of help they need to get to the top score that they need to get into these great schools. So so it's maybe a little more similar, really, even though the SAT is, like, on the surface seems like a much bigger market. Okay, and then the last thing is location. I think for the GMAT and GRE, a lot of these people are going to be in cities, so yeah, if you're in especially New York City, San Francisco, Bay Area, things like that. So I mean, if you're an operator in one of those locations, then yeah, in-person tutoring for sure is important. But I think if you're not in a major metropolitan area, then I think you're just going to have a much lower, there's going to be far fewer people looking for in-person GMAT and GRE tutoring, especially GMAT, maybe GRE a little bit more so. So in that case, I think online tutoring is a major, it's got to be a major component if you really want to have enough of a customer base, to attract. I had one more point. I guess that was it. Okay, so yeah, I mean, that was pretty much it. I think I almost nailed it at 30 minutes. Kevin, what do you think?
I think that was outstanding. I had no idea you were such an excellent presenter, although I guess I should have assumed since you've been teaching and tutoring for 20 years. So yeah, it was great. And I think there was a lot of good information in there. So folks, if you have questions for Brian, please ask them now. You're welcome to unmute. And let me see if I can.
Do I want to stop sharing, or do I want to stay on screen share here?
You can just keep that, I think, the way it is. Yeah. Unless there's another slide. Do you have a slide that has your contact information? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So